Good morning and welcome to this week's live edition of Avero. We're kicking off Public Housing Month in our marketing efforts this month because we are really, number one, we care, and we are seeing that there's a lot of confusion in the market about how to replace older ERP systems, older housing management systems, and just how to go about getting that next vendor in. And what's also happening is that there is one vendor we can't name, but you know who it is. That is the 800-pound gorilla. They've been hoarding the market for the last 30 plus years. Um, and then there are three or four others that are smaller, upcoming. They're trying. And there's one major property management companies that's starting to just come and eat up the market space that's being left behind by the incumbent. What we're also seeing is that because there is so much demand, uh, prospects are taking the first proposal that comes out of a vendor. They're taking the first contract that comes out of a vendor, just to show there's a perception and illusion of speed there. But you're gonna go back to do the homework at the end anyway. So with that said, again, kicking off Public Housing Month here at Avero, we want to raise awareness of the industry itself and all the great work they do, but also we want to be here to support that industry. And we have several clients that we've helped. And I'll stop pitching our services there. Robert, welcome to the show, wherever you are in this world.
Thank you. On the East Coast this week, usually based out of Phoenix, but I get a little bit of a break in the weather and get to go to the East Coast.
Okay, so the topic we have today is really key questions your IT staff is not asking the software vendor. And you used to be IT for a city. You've done this. You've been on the other side, and you've chosen vendors before, good and bad. And I think the topic is pertinent because um, we want to make sure we're educating our clients, because more often than not, these projects are handed over to an IT director or a CIO or an IT manager. And great professionals, they're good at what they do. They've grown up as network engineers and network managers. And here they are trying to negotiate an ERP contract that has mostly to do with financial operations and housing operations. And the knowledge, banks don't quite match there most of the time. So where would you start with all of this being the reality?
So what I would always do mentally on the other side of the table is I'd break the points and the questions and the information you need to get out of the vendor into two areas. One is it's the realm of I can ask this question and I can understand the answer. The other area is I can ask this question, but I'm going to need clarity to get an answer because I'm not the end user. I think it's a distinction we need to make. As IT experts, we tell ourselves, well, it's a system, so we should be experts at everything systems. And we are to a degree, but you're not the end user. You're not the end consumer. And so you're going to need, as we're going to talk about later, how to bridge that gap between the subject matter expert let's just start with that question. Yeah. As an IT director, and usually it's being put into your lap of go out and find me a different vendor or get me into an upgraded system, especially if you've had a leadership change and you call the vendor and the vendor's going to tell you all sorts of nice things. Like we can get you live at 6 weeks, which is almost completely impossible. Yeah. But let's start with as an IT director, you need to figure out how you're going to bridge that gap between this is my end user who I have to train, but I also need their input into this new system or refining the system and setting the policies, especially with how rich policy and compliance is with housing. Mm-hmm. Also mixed in with the local flavor of how you are housing people in your organization, and if you own property. So all these little details that an IT manager is never going to know. I don't care if you've been in housing for 3 decades. You are not going to know the ins and outs of policy changes and HUD changes unless you do that completely for a living and don't do any of your other IT duties. So you really should be asking the vendor, great product, great demo. Sometimes you haven't even seen a demo, right? And someone's already signed you to this company because the housing authority, a couple miles down the road decided to go with these folks. Ask the vendor, how are you going to bridge that gap between my end user and your subject matter expert on this? and you're going to have to engage leadership in your organization to be able to bridge that gap, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and there's merit to taking the lead from the neighboring housing authority, but we also need to look at what kind of stumbling blocks they've gone through or how long ago they implemented this new and shiny system, right? That could be a starting point because trust plays an important role in making a big decision like this. So if you trust the executive director or IT director at the housing authority in the next city, then that's a good starting point. But it doesn't negate the fact that you still have to do your homework and really do this the right way and not just hand it to IT. And like you said, just because it has the word software and it doesn't mean it's IT's responsibility. It's 2023, and managing enterprise software and applications that end users use to run operations is slowly getting away from the IT department. They are more responsible for cybersecurity infrastructure, backups, if any, and basically making sure the lights turn on and the computers turn on and everything's secure from an infrastructure standpoint. So you're right. Unless they spend most of their careers doing compliance or intake or eligibility for housing authorities, it's really hard to understand this business. I mean, we barely get it, right? And we're not
Yeah.
shy about saying that this is a very complicated business.
If every housing authority was the same, we could all use the same plan, and the
Mhm.
vendor would be an expert at implementation. Um,
Yeah.
but they are housing authorities, as we've talked about, are at the extreme. They are incredibly different. Each one has a completely different dynamic, and there's all sorts of undercurrents that are feeding a lot of the processes and the way you do them, that are just not going to be. Again, Silicon Valley Housing Authority
Hmm.
is who we did some work for.
Yeah.
That's a completely different animal than some of the rural ones and the others in smaller cities. Your typical housing authority. But even then, typical is a terrible word to use because there is no typical housing authority. I mean, just between managing property and voucher management and compliance, every single one is a different beast. And the software companies, they're just they're there to sell you a platform.
Hmm.
That's it. And they want to be able to customize it and set it up to the best of their ability,
Yeah.
hopefully, to serve you. But at the end of the day, you need an advocate that's going to help you set it up correctly. And a lot of that advocacy has to come from within your organization. And IT just doesn't have the bandwidth or the expertise
Yeah.
to do something like that.
And we're saying this in support of IT, right? We're not saying
Yeah.
they can't do this. It really, you need to have worked in housing. Like, this is a typical project for a finance director on the financial side, and on the housing side, would you say it? I mean, we've seen it led by the compliance director. We've seen it led by the housing operations manager. Who is the customer for the Section 8 modules and the public housing modules and all of the compliance that goes with it?
So perfect time for me to just beg housing authorities, stop trying to make your CIO an expert in 7 areas that are actually should be housed with 7 different people.
Hmm.
Compliance is a great one. IT is obviously has a lot of the tools that you need to enforce compliance, but you're asking IT to be a compliance expert on HUD, on PII, on HIPAA, um, on document management strategies, public record strategies. It's impossible to find 7 roles, 7 distinct full-time roles into one particular IT person.
Yeah.
Leadership has to be involved in a lot of that as well.
Hmm.
Even cybersecurity compliance, we almost always recommend, unless you're very, very small, you need to house that with someone outside of IT, and rather than making your CIO the expert in so many of those things. So
Yeah.
housing authorities, please, please, please reconsider if you're going to put everything on the CIO to go out and find a new system for you. You're sending them down a very dangerous path where in some cases they're going to start making assumptions on things that are going to turn out to not be true. And you're right, we're not here to beat up on IT staff at all. It's quite the other way around. The private sector model, for complete contrast, is CIOs are true C-suite people. They spend all their time with leadership. They spend all their time visioning,
Yeah.
not as we've seen in a lot of cases. A lot of housing authorities, the IT director is hanging monitors on the wall, is replacing workstations, is running cabling. That's not an adequate use of their time, and it's not really what they're designed to do.
Well, that's the fallacy, right? You've been in the help desk role or network role or systems role for the last 20 years. Most senior person gets to be the IT director. Um, and if they don't have an exposure or an interest in understanding what the operation side looks like, how the sausage is made, then they're not going to be a very good CIO, especially not in wartime, as I call it, when you're replacing an ERP system. You know that there's as students of history, there's prime ministers that are peacetime prime ministers and prime ministers that are wartime prime ministers. You need the
Yeah.
right leadership in a time like when you're replacing an ERP system. And I hate to use that analogy, right? But it is like that. It's a once in a lifetime, once in a career type event that happens that you really need to put your best foot forward. And not having an understanding of operations is just detrimental to the whole process.
Or you're in the middle of a pandemic, and now you have to find a
Right.
way to send all your employees home because the state mandates it. At the same
Hmm.
time, you're trying to service your citizens. You're trying to keep your landlords paid and happy because a lot of what you do for a lot of housing authorities depends upon the good relationship that you have with the landlord.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, the landlords are feeling an economic crunch. A lot of them
Hmm.
wanted to get paid twice a month rather than waiting a month for their portion of HAP.
Yeah.
And so everything got thrown into chaos, and a lot of organizations that never had to think about how am I going to service housing people as well as my landlords at the same time had to throw this together overnight. And it's not that we saw the weaknesses in IT. We saw what happens when you turn to them and you throw everything at them, including the way you're doing business, and go out and figure out how to do this in 2 or 3 days so I can be back up and running with the remote staff who's also servicing all of the people I'm trying to house. Impossible task.
Yeah. So let's go back to the topic at hand. We can talk about this all day. 5 key questions your IT staff is not asking the software vendor. Again, not a dig at IT folks. Love you guys, but um, this is to help the IT departments understand the responsibility of picking an enterprise resource planning or a housing authority operations management system, um, with the humility that you may not know everything about the operations.
Ask one of my favorite questions that no one, it's obvious, but no one seems to ask at first out of the gate is, what does go live mean to you? What does it mean to the vendor? Get a definition on that because they're going to tell you they can take you live in a couple of weeks. Some are
Yeah,
going to tell you all we need is one data conversion. All we need is one configuration. Sometimes they say we don't even need to set up a test environment for you. We'll just start building the live environment right now, and then we'll transition your users.
yeah,
You you have to ask what that definition of go live is, and you also need to take it back to your leadership as well, because go live is much more complicated to get there. You have to be able to do all the setup that you need to do, all the testing, and then once that's taken care of, then you actually train your end users before you go live. So just that simple question should be able to spark a ton of information, both from your leadership as well as your software vendor. And
hmm,
then you, as the IT manager, have to find a way to get those aligned
yeah,
so that the vendor understands you're not going to be able to quote me 6 weeks of prep and go live. I'm going to need a lot longer. And the follow up question I would have that you should be asking is, what does post go live support look like? Some people don't ask that question. They just assume it's in the contract language. I'll be covered,
yeah.
right? You want to ask that question first, not after you put ink on a contract.
Right. What does it mean to you? What is go live? When you were running large projects on the other side, what did that mean to you?
Go live is my end users are happy. They're ready to start using the system. They know how to use the system and they're comfortable with the way it was set up. And then the same thing with the process managers. For me, it actually had very little to do with leadership. We are just the facilitators for getting you there. If
Mhm.
my end user isn't ready, if I got a department director that says, my staff wasn't trained on this one particular thing, we can't go live, I'm going to stop where we are and make sure that's covered before we go live. There's no halfway go live. I mean,
Yeah.
it does not work. It's always set up for failure. And the caveat that I always have that people have to think about is if you tell yourself, we'll fix that later, I just need to go live today, you'll never go back and fix it.
Hmm.
I You will never go back and fix it. It's almost impossible.
Yeah.
The minute you're done with the project, you want to go back to your regular job and your regular duties that have been piling up. You're not going to go back and revisit the policy configuration on how you're handling a particular type of voucher.
Hmm.
You have to get it right while you have everyone's attention with this new system. Configure it, get it right, make sure everyone is signed off and everyone's ready to go, and then you're ready for a go live. So that's the
Yeah.
definition I would give of vendors of what a go live looks like to me.
And also, I would include all the modules, right? It's not like we'll do the handhelds and the inspections later. We'll do X, Y, and Z. We'll do, payroll, not payroll and HR, but we'll do recruitment later. None of that works. Like you said, no one goes back and redoes an implementation. You have to keep the tempo and the beat all the way through go live. And I think go live needs to be defined by the public housing authority before the vendor even shows up for a kickoff meeting. Because otherwise,
Yeah.
they're going to tell you, like you said, 6 months from now you're live, and everyone says thumbs up, and the time milestone itself isn't necessarily go live. There's so much more at stake.
Well, what I always worried about is you can get caught with the rug being pulled out from underneath you in that your vendor goes, okay, we went live, right?
Hmm.
I'm going to throw you over to regular support now.
Yeah,
So
sign here.
all those relationships that you built during the implementation with either your implementation consultant, your implementation manager, your project manager, that relationship, sorry to say, is going to evaporate the moment you go live and they turn you over to regular support. You're not going to be
Hmm.
able to pick up the phone and call that implementation manager and get a question answered in 30 minutes. They're going to say, did you go through regular support? You guys transition from go live to regular support. You have their maximum attention. And this leads into another question. You have their maximum attention before that go live. And one of the ways you do it, honestly, is do not pay them out of the gate. For sure, do not give them your software vendor the full amount the minute you put ink on a contract. And in fact, in very few cases do you need to actually put any money down at the time of contract signing. You're not buying a car and then driving it off the lot. So get ink on the contract after you figured out the payment terms and made it clear that we are going to go through a milestone. There's some sort of a structured payment. We're going to go quarterly, not monthly. Identify who's going to review those invoices. Make sure you're going to get your money's worth. Um, don't I beg of people, please do not just give them all the money up front and go, okay, you said 6 weeks to go live. Let's go. I'm going to go back to my regular job. Give me a
Yeah.
call when we're live. And
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating, but we run into that sort of mentality on a regular basis.
Well, that's what causes failed implementations, right? It's the lack of communications and understanding of the process, and relying too much on the vendor's word. Again, not bashing IT people. This is the practice. So they'll present to you the first contract that has all of the terms in their favor, including things like payments up front, payments tied to specific dates and not milestones. Like big chunk of money 3 months from now. What does that mean? What happens in 3 months? Why would we pay you in 3 months? Are there milestones attached to payment terms? And one of my favorite things to talk about is balance of payments. You've heard me say this before. What is your leverage when things go sideways with this vendor? What do you have to hold against them? Now, there are vendors that don't care. They don't give two hoots about how much money you're holding. We had one client that held $1.2 million from a large ERP vendor, and the only ask was to get somebody on the phone, someone that could make executive decisions on the phone to talk to our client. And that went on for about 6 months before we got a VP to, you know, reluctantly show up on a phone call and then be non-committal. So it's really important to hold vendors to milestones and to not just write the check when the invoice shows up.
Yeah,
Just
you have
be
to
really diligent.
look, you have to look at vendors from the perspective of they've got a million customers, they're short staffed like everyone else.
Hmm.
If there's a way they can do your project with a minimal amount of time, they're going to do that. And
Yeah.
so it's the days are gone where they're going to proactively constantly hound you with let's get going on this and let's meet this deadline. Honestly, if you're not willing to move fast, but you're not also not willing to put a plan in front of them or tell them
Hmm.
what you need, they're going to do the basics of what they need to do to fulfill that contract and get you live and move on. It's just a
Yeah.
natural part of business for software selection. And
Yeah.
the other thing that you have to remember as a housing authority is software vendor is not an expert in how you do housing. You are the expert in how you do it. Don't let them just dictate how the system is going to be used.
Hmm.
That's the most important thing. Don't let them dictate the way you're going to go live. Don't let them dictate the way you're going to be supported post go live. Don't let them dictate how you're going to do cybersecurity, which is like one of the last things I wanted to bring up before we go. We talk about it on a fairly regular basis, but
Yeah.
you need to be in control, and you're putting a lot of money into the system. You have the right to demand and ask for these things. I've never seen a customer that was over demanding with their software
Be
company.
over demanding. I mean, you
That's
would do this when you're building a new housing development. You wouldn't let a contractor get off the hook. You ask for a certain grade of cement, and now they're putting another one that's cheaper or more expensive, and they will charge you for it. You wouldn't let that vendor or contractor off the hook. You have to think of ERP replacements and systems replacements in the same sort of importance and urgency as you would with a physical construction project. It almost costs the same. Um,
yeah. And continuity between transition of systems is
yeah.
so vital in housing. I mean, you can't be down for 3 days. You can't be down for a day in some cases because you have landlords who are logging into the portal 24 hours a day transacting business with you
Mhm.
or housing a tenant. Um, you can't afford to have a weekend plus one workday down for a system transition. And so you have to be clear about that up front. Same thing with your financials, right? The check run next week's going to happen whether you're going live or not, and it has to be done correctly.
Right.
So these are all the things that you have to consider. That in some of our other clients, they can afford to have several days of downtime or a week of downtime. Housing is just a continual rolling operation
Mm,
of getting people housed, getting money to the landlord, um, dealing with compliance, dealing with reporting issues, plus your regular payments to vendors and all your other financials as well that you have to take in consideration, paying your employees. All these sorts of things are on a constant rolling basis with housing authorities. There really is no break, there's no pause, and it's almost impossible to find a way to build in a break or a pause to do a
yeah.
system transition.
All right. Next question. Let me go. Who's going to implement the system? Now, this might be. It might seem obvious if a vendor is selling you their software, they must be implementing it, right? So here we are, contract signed. No one read it, or they read it from a legal perspective, but not pay attention to the scope of work and who's doing what or the roles involved. Uh, what we've seen is um, there's different roles, obviously, in a system implementation. But what's surprising is even within software vendor instances, in a larger implementation, you have the company selling the software. There's a system integrator, there's PM teams, there's a conglomeration of different agencies that do this. For housing, what we've seen is the vendor will sell you the product. They'll sell you the system or the rights to the subscription for a certain amount of money. And they will say you have two options. You can do full service professional services, or you can just buy the software. Now, in neither case is the vendor doing the implementing. Now, let's talk about what that means. What does it mean to implement the system? It means working with your staff on a daily basis to make sure that the configurations are done right, that the workflows are configured correctly, that there's adequate security, that your reports come out the way you want them to, that your checks are being cut, that your wait lists are being managed properly. That needs real, you know, inside the engine sort of tinkering that the vendor that sells you the software is not going to do. So you will have to find a third party implementation um, configuration expert, that's not us. We're more on the project management side. But there's several companies that do that for specific vendors that will be add-ons to your contract. So if the vendor said this is only going to cost you $300,000 up front, $300,000 per year, and we're good, sign here. No, that number's probably 3 times as much on the front end when it comes to implementation.
And who's going to handle your help desk once you go live?
Yeah.
That's the key thing. You can call the software vendor and report a problem, but they're not really help desk. They're not. You need someone there to triage what's going on with your new system and determine, is this an IT issue, meaning it's just something with the workstation, the infrastructure, then it goes to the housing authority's IT shop. Is this an end user issue? They're not following the policy manual. Your software vendor is not going to know what your policy manual is or even care what your policy manual is. So you also need to figure out, does this need to refer to policy and compliance or training because this person's not using the system correctly or following policy? And then there's the, yes, this is actually a systems issue.
Mm-hmm.
Let me kick that to the software vendor. Because as a housing authority executive, you know your staff doesn't have time, barely has time for what it does now. You're probably already struggling to retain people as well anyway in this job market. That's not going to get better when you do a system implementation. So you're going to have a partner, and we've helped folks find long-term partners to be able to manage that help desk for you, or do a staff augmentation during the implementation, because that's the other thing too. Someone needs to come in and figure out what makes you, translate that into software vendor terms, and then manage that throughout the implementation process, because your staff is not going to have the time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've touched on cybersecurity briefly earlier, so let's talk about that and the questions to ask. What would you say is the top question IT or whoever's doing the selection needs to ask a software as a service or cloud hosted vendor?
What is cybersecurity going to look like for that environment? And that distills down to several other questions too, which is, how are you guys going to back up this environment? How are you going to restore a database? And I wish I was exaggerating. We've run into issues where vendors have overwritten the wrong database and weren't able to restore it because they only do monthly snapshots. Or in some cases, they don't even snapshot the test database. They assume it's expendable if it gets deleted. Well, guess what? Your folks have been doing work in there for weeks, testing a new policy, our new procedure, our new voucher management system report. You have to ask those sub questions that go in there in terms of, what's disaster recovery? If something goes wrong, are you guys able to restore the way it was 24 hours ago, 10 minutes ago, 5 weeks ago, 6 months ago?
Yeah.
Trust me, you don't want to wait until you are actually in a disaster recovery situation to ask those questions, because you're not going to like the answer, and the vendor's going to go, no, it's buried somewhere in the contract. We only back up, do full backups once a month. The other thing is, whatever compliance, and especially if you're in an area where there's a heavy focus on compliance, because of all the PII that housing authorities have, it's just incredible. Whatever standard you're being held to by HUD, by local compliance, by HIPAA, by the feds, you have to pass that on to the vendor in the contract language and make sure that they are as responsible for keeping that information safe, and that they have safeguards and they have disaster recovery just as much as the pressure is on you as an IT director. Because at the end of the day, they're going to come talk to you. They're not going to come to the software vendor to figure out, why was there a data breach, or why did you just lose 4,000 hours worth of voucher information, because no one asked the question about, is the system being backed up on a regular basis? So very simple question, but distills down into a lot of subcategories that CIOs already have on their mind. You're already thinking about this stuff. Ask the question of your proposed software vendor.
And in context, right? Why is it different? Most systems today in most housing authorities are on premise. You have a server in your data center, in your server room, in IT, that the system lives on. So the configuration of your cybersecurity is different than when you're trying to access a production software in the cloud. And in the cloud means on someone else's computer, right? In some other building. May not be one computer, may not be one server. It's distributed across the country. So those are really important questions to ask, because you as an IT director will have to adjust your infrastructure to take on a SaaS enterprise system. um,
Yeah,
and shore up your security.
so, and I don't want anyone to think that SaaS increases your cybersecurity risks. I mean, the most common attack vector still is your end user on the device that they're using. That's where almost all cybersecurity attacks or data breaches occur. It rarely is someone just hacks into your housing system that's being hosted and steals all your data. I mean, the environments that they have to live within to host that service and provide it to you are incredibly secure. The feds have been up in the cloud for several decades now. But what happens is when you have an event, and we had this as one of our clients too, supposedly there was some fraud that needed to be investigated that was done through a landlord portal. If you don't have that information from your software vendor, it very quickly just becomes finger pointing and you can't get to the answer. And what we were looking to do is, was there actually a data breach or fraud that occurred in there? It turned out no. A landlord shared their password um, in a Word document that got into the wrong hands, and someone in there and tried to change all the checks to be sent to this address rather than to the
Yeah.
landlord. So you have to be able to sort through those situations quickly. I mean, your executives at your housing authority are going to want an answer today, not in 4 weeks. And when you have language like that worked out already, you can very quickly find out what's going on and negate the situation or determine that it is not fraud or anything that you're liable for or the software vendor is liable for. And you can just simply move forward rather than dragging something out for
Hmm.
months and months and winding up in the headlines.
Yeah. And it's not the IT director that's in the headlines. I mean, they are, but it's the executive directors and CEOs taking the heat and the board.
Yeah.
So this goes all the way up. We have an audience question. What should I be wary of when identifying potential vendors? Are there specific red flags to look out for? So for housing authorities, it's the choice isn't too big. That's the problem, right? At this moment, there are maybe five viable um, systems out there that housing authorities can go seek, and regardless, the red flags remain the same. I mean, these are, we bash them quite a bit, but it's not because of the systems itself. They have some really good systems. It all comes down to how you contract, how you project manage, how you set up your business practices. So inherently, there are, to me, no real red flags. We know all of these players, unless there's someone new that doesn't quite have the goods. That's one red flag. We have so many different software vendors that don't have a client, that have one client, that haven't really shown the track record um, of having been around and knowing public housing. So that's one red flag, right? If you're proposing on one of our clients and you don't have any clients that are housing authorities, we probably assume that you don't have an understanding of the business.
My first question would be, and even a potential vendor, don't even wait till contract or after contract signing. Ask them for your project plan. Show me what my project plan is for implementation.
Yeah.
Because out of that, not only is it going to be, do they actually understand how you function, but are they actually showing details like check runs occur every 2 weeks. So we need to make sure that we time these things so they're not occurring in the week when there's a middle of a check run. All these little things that occur in housing authorities that you have to think. Tax season, getting 1099 information out to your landlords. That usually occurs at the very beginning of the year, and they have to get it in by February usually. You're not going to go in and replace the financial systems in late January. Make them put a project plan
Yeah.
together that is yours, not just a generic one, because we've seen that too, right?
Yeah.
What's the line? Your project plan will look something like this, and then they put up a generic project plan.
Yeah.
Make them show you your project plan and
Yeah.
look at it.
At
Does this
kickoff.
actually make sense? Does it? I mean, even the basics. Do they look like they know what they're talking about when it comes to operations for a housing authority?
Hmm.
That's the first. If they can't do that, that's my first red flag.
Yeah. So, question 5 on the 5 questions to ask the vendor, right? What do IT operations look like post go live? Very important question, because if you're on premise, if you've been with the same vendor for the last 20 years, 30 years, you've had to staff up for maintaining servers, patching servers, replacement cycles, backups, report writing, all of these very specialized functions And report writing is critical because it's, you know, you spend months on a simple report, because not because they're incapable of producing reports, because the data that lives on your servers from this vendor is in such bad shape that you have to spend most of your time scrubbing it. So back to the question, what do IT operations look like? Because when you go live on a software as a service platform that is hosted somewhere else, all of a sudden the real, the natural tendency is to think about, okay, what am I going to do with my people that have had full-time jobs be maintaining this one server for this software or writing reports for this software.
And that should be asked at the very beginning.
Yeah.
The minute and a lot of these questions, again, the minute the vendor calls you and says, hey, you guys haven't looked at my system in a couple of years, let me do a demo for you, let me send you some information, you're really going to like it. This housing authority, across the county just went live with us, and they love it. Start asking these questions immediately. Don't wait until there's a demo, that there's contracting. But
Yeah.
that's a good point, especially if you're, a lot of times these larger housing authorities are also, they're doing the vouchers for the neighboring city, as well as potentially the county, or maybe even for the region as well. It's not just your own jurisdiction in terms of housing. The reporting behind that is incredibly complex, and it has to continue. Not continuing it is just simply not an option. So you're exactly right. If you're used to having this report writer and this database expert who concentrated just in this one system, this question has to be asked at the very beginning and not wait until you're 2 weeks before you go live and you're like, by the way, what's my database administrator going to do after we go live? There's nothing for him or her to do. Terrible time to be asking that question.
Yeah.
Should have been done at the very beginning.
Yeah. This is also, I mean, the reason that change is resisted, right? They see it coming, that we'll have to make adjustments to our staffing. The budgets are going to go down. My database experts will have to do something else. Help desk. We've seen it in a recent go live. There was a client had a very specialized person that knew this system in and out, and that person was invaluable as long as they were in that older environment. When they moved to a software as a service hosted environment, this really expert database person, of course, they had the basic knowledge that they could apply to any database, but instead they had to, change positions, change roles, and that's something that was thought about at the very beginning but not resolved. No one had thought through what's going to happen with this position or this person. So, really good question, really important question to ask upfront and start planning for it, because it's inevitable. You have to ask this at some point. And this isn't again not directed to whittle down the strength of IT or um, reduce the budgets. Actually, you can do more with less if you have a good strong database person or systems admin. You can now focus on things like cybersecurity or agency wide operations.
Yeah, you touched on change management, which is outside the scope of what we're talking about here, but incredibly important to housing because, again, of the policy. One of our clients, the policies and procedures manual was well over 1,000 pages.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do you manage it? I was in awe of their ability to just manage the change and updates, and they did. They did an outstanding job on doing that. The software vendor is not going to be a change management expert. You probably, as a housing authority executive, don't even feel like you've got a good grasp on change management.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to changing out a system, you're right. You don't. This is for very specialized areas. Folks like us can offer those types of services to guide you and keep things going, because new systems always, first thing staff thinks is, what is this going to do to my job? They feel threatened by this. Or like you're talking about, this database expert who's an expert on the old system is going to be very resistant to this new one because they want to live in that world where they feel like they're the expert, not this new one that's in an environment where I don't have to do as much. So change management is very difficult on these projects, but there's a way to handle that and keep it moving forward.
Yeah. Oh, these are great questions. So to recap, first question, what does go live mean to you and to the vendor, and match that up. Match it up and make sure that your definitions are the same. Uh, what are the ideal payment terms? make sure they're in your favor, that you're not paying anything upfront, and that you're always having leverage to work against a vendor if things are going sideways.
And ask, why do I
Yeah,
have to give you this money to set up this environment that I'm not going to be able to touch for 3 months?
right. The next one was who's going to implement the system? Very critical question, because if not asked, you'll find out soon after kickoff that you're on the hook to find the experts that will actually configure the system. Um, what is cybersecurity going to look like post implementation? And what do my IT operations look like post implementation or post go live? Uh, these are just 5 questions. There's a ton more. If you need to talk to us about more, or if you need help with negotiations, we're always here. We've helped several clients do the same thing. And with that, Robert, if there's nothing else, we can let you go on with your next meetings on the East
Yeah,
Coast.
I encourage folks, if you have some questions you want to send to us, I would love to do another session like this on another series of questions in this specific area. So please reach out with any questions or comments, and we would love to give you a bunch of free advice based upon our experience.
Yeah, and to reiterate, this is Public Housing Authority month for us. Um, that means that we'll be focusing a lot of content on this specific industry and on the specific area that we feel like is underserved, not just by the vendors, but also consultants like us. So look forward to more. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.